The Tallgrass Prairie Preserve in the heart of Oklahoma was a sea of undulating grass, a sprawling sanctuary, where the wilderness was allowed to speak its own ancient language. But even in this carefully managed paradise, there were discordant notes. There was Goliath, a 2,000-pound bull bison who was less a part of the herd, and more a solitary island of magnificent resentment, driven from the main herd years ago for his aggressive temperament. He now roamed the preserve's northern territories. A brooding king on a throne of loneliness, the other rangers gave him a wide berth, his reputation preceding him like a thundercloud. He had shattered the reinforced oak fence of a holding pen during a health check, and had once charged a jeep for coming too close to his favorite wallow. His power was undeniable, but it was the look in his dark, intelligent eyes that truly unsettled the staff. It wasn't just anger, it was a profound and weary sorrow, as if he were carrying the weight of a loss. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. No one else could see Sam Cody, the preserve's head ranger, a man whose face was a roadmap of decades spent under the unforgiving sun, summed up the consensus. Goliath isn't just dominant, he's a liability. We manage him by leaving him alone. It's the only safe way. But into this established order of cautious avoidance came Dr. Aris Thorne, a young behavioral biologist with eyes that saw things differently. Aris had arrived at the preserve 3 weeks ago, a quiet, thoughtful woman seeking refuge from the cutthroat world of academia, where her unconventional theories on animal emotional intelligence had been ridiculed by her more traditional peers. She had been labeled as sentimental, unscientific, and an outcast in her own field, a label that now allowed her to see a kindred spirit in the preserve's most notorious resident. She was assigned to Goliath's territory, a task the other rangers considered a thankless and slightly dangerous form of rookie hazing. For hours each day, Aris would sit in her observation jeep parked on a ridge overlooking Goliath's domain. She watched not with the detached gaze of a scientist, but with the focused empathy of someone trying to understand a forgotten language. She saw what the others missed. She noticed that Goliath's charges were never blind rampages. They were precise, calculated warnings. He never sought to destroy, only to define his space. She documented how his supposed moodiness was tied to the weather, to the phases of the moon, to the direction of the wind. He was not chaotic, he was communicating with the world in the only way. He knew how a silent bond began to form across the grassy plains. The massive bull grew accustomed to the quiet presence of the jeep on the ridge. He would sometimes stop his grazing and stare back at her, and in those long, silent exchanges, Aris felt a sense of communion, a meeting of two lonely souls who had both been pushed to the margins of their worlds, but another shadow was moving through. The tall grass, an alien presence that did not belong. Reports had been trickling in for weeks from ranchers on the preserve's borders, strange tracks in the mud, disappearing chickens, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Last week, a trail camera had captured a blurry image that sent a chill through the entire staff. A massive snake, far larger than any native species, its patterned skin identifying it as a reticulated python, a creature of the Southeast Asian jungles, not the Oklahoma prairie. It was most likely a released pet now grown to monstrous proportions, a ghost in the ecosystem slithering its way toward the heart of the sanctuary. The rangers began a desperate search, trying to track and capture the invasive predator before it could do irreparable damage to the native wildlife. The python represented the unknown, a fear born of something that was dangerously out of place. The two outcasts of the preserve, Goliath, the shunned king, and the python, a creature exiled from its own world, were moving through the same territory on a collision course that seemed destined for a violent conclusion. When two powerful beings, each scarred by rejection, are set to cross paths in the heart of the wilderness, can a silent understanding avert a tragedy, or are some forces of nature destined only for destruction? If you've ever felt like an outcast or believed in something that no one else understood, then you know the power of a quiet conviction hit that like button. to show your support for all the misunderstood souls in the world, and please, subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that prove even the loneliest heart has a purpose. Thank you for being a part of our community that finds hope in the most unexpected places. The air grew heavy and thick. A few days later, the Oklahoma sky turning the color of a deep bruise as a summer storm began to gather on the horizon. Reese felt at first a prickling on her skin, an ancient instinct that told her the atmosphere was charged with more than just rain. The animals felt it too. The birds fell silent, and the distant bison herd clustered together nervously. Goliath, however, seemed more agitated than the rest. He paced his territory relentlessly, his massive head swinging back and forth, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the electrically charged air. Reese watched him from her usual ridge, her scientific mind cataloging his behavior while her intuition screamed that something was wrong. He wasn't just restless because of the storm. He was on guard. He was protecting something. Her suspicions had been growing for weeks. She had noticed Goliath frequently returning to a secluded thicket near a creek bed, an area of his territory he defended. With unusual ferocity, she had tried to get closer, but he had always driven her away. With a display of power that was both terrifying and definitive, the other rangers dismissed it as just another one of the bull's quirks, but Reese believed it was something more. She had caught fleeting glimpses of a smaller shape in the tall grass near the thicket, too small to be a deer, too clumsy to be a coyote. The thought was almost impossible to consider, but the evidence was mounting. Goliath, the solitary, rejected bull, had taken on a ward that afternoon. Her theory was tragically confirmed as the first drops of rain began to fall. A desperate bleating sound echoed from the creek bed. It was the cry of a bison calf, terrified and in pain. Through her powerful binoculars, Reese saw a small calf, no more than a few months old, hopelessly entangled in the coils of a monstrous serpent. The invasive python had found the secret. Goliath was keeping its massive body, a shimmering nightmare of muscle and pattern, was wrapped around the calf's small frame, constricting with slow, deadly pressure. Goliath was in a frenzy. He charged back and forth a few yards away, roaring in a mixture of rage and desperation, but he seemed to understand that a blind charge could injure the calf as much as the snake. He was a king trapped, a father helpless to save his child. Reese's hands trembled as she grabbed her radio. Sam, Goliath's territory at the creek bed. The python has the calf. The message was met with a stunned silence on the other end. The existence of the calf was a shock, but the unfolding tragedy was a horror. Sam's voice crackled back. Stay where you are, Reese. Do not approach. We're on our way, but it's a 20-minute drive. We're not going to make it in time. The words hung in the air, a death sentence for the calf. Reese watched through her binoculars, her heart breaking as the calf's struggles grew weaker. She felt a profound sense of helplessness, a mirror of what the giant bull must be feeling. They were both witnesses to a tragedy they were powerless to stop. But then Goliath did something that would forever alter the understanding of animal intelligence. On the preserve, the great bull stopped his frantic pacing. He stood for a long moment, his massive body perfectly still, as if engaged in a moment of intense calculation. The storm broke, then rain lashing down and lightning tearing across the sky, illuminating the horrific scene in stark flashes of white. What happened next was not an act of blind rage. It was an act of tactical genius. Goliath lowered his head and charged, but not at the center of the python's coiled mass. Instead, he aimed for the snake's tail. With breathtaking precision, he hooked his massive horn under the serpent's body, and with a powerful upward thrust, he began to unspool the deadly knot. He used his immense weight not to crush but to pin sections of the snake to the muddy ground, forcing it to loosen its grip in order to defend itself. The python, a powerful predator in its own right, was completely unprepared for such a strategic assault. It released its hold on the calf to strike at the bull, but Goliath was ready. He absorbed the snake's desperate bites on his thick hide, barely flinching as he continued his methodical work of liberation. He was like a surgeon using his horns and hooves as instruments, using controlled power To save a life, not to take one. Sam and the other rangers arrived just in time to witness the final moments of the incredible battle. They skidded to a halt in their jeeps, their mouths agape at the scene unfolding before them. Goliath, the problem. Animal, the sullen outcast, was displaying a level of intelligence and precision that seemed impossible. He wasn't just a beast fighting for its young. He was a general executing a perfect strategy. With a final powerful shrug, Goliath freed the calf. Completely, the small creature stumbled away, bleeding in terror at sides. Bruised but miraculously alive, the python, now injured and exhausted, tried to slither away into the undergrowth. And here came the second shock, the part of the story that the rangers would tell for the rest of their lives. Goliath did not pursue. He did not deliver a killing blow. He simply turned his back on the defeated predator and walked to the calf's side. He began to gently nuzzle the small creature, licking its wet fur and making low rumbling sounds of comfort. His massive body formed a living shield around the calf, protecting it from the storm and the eyes of the watching world. He had fought with the mind of a warrior, but now he was showing the heart of a father. We expect the wild to be ruled by a brutal and unforgiving code, but what happens when a creature we've labeled as a monster shows a wisdom that transcends our understanding? Can an act of unexpected mercy teach us more about the nature of strength than any display of violent force? The rain softened to a steady drizzle as the last of the thunder rumbled in the distance. The rangers stood in silence, soaked to the bone, their earlier urgency replaced by a profound sense of awe. They were not just looking at a bison and its calf. They were looking at a king and his heir, a family that had been forged in secrecy and revealed in a moment of breathtaking courage. Sam Cody, the veteran ranger who had once called Goliath a liability, slowly took off his hat, a gesture of deep respect. The assumptions he had held for years had been shattered in a matter of minutes. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was something more, something that felt profoundly personal and intelligent. Reese approached slowly, her boots sinking into the wet earth. She stopped a respectful distance away, her eyes not on the calf but on Goliath. The great bull looked at her, and there was no threat in his gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement, a shared understanding. He had allowed her to witness his most vulnerable secret, and in doing so had confirmed the silent bond they had built from afar. You were protecting him all along, she whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of the rain. You weren't angry. You were a father. He's an orphan, she continued, piecing the story together from her observations. The main herd must have abandoned him when his mother died. Goliath, you took him, and Sam and his team moved with a new sense of purpose. Their mission had changed from managing a dangerous animal to supporting a family. They set up a perimeter, not to contain Goliath, but to protect him and the calf from other predators drawn by the scent of the python's struggle. The story of Goliath's incredible rescue and his secret life as a surrogate father spread through the entire preserve staff like a cleansing fire. It challenged every protocol, every long-held belief about animal behavior. It forced them to look at their charges not as subjects to be managed, but as complex individuals with rich emotional lives. The incident prompted a complete overhaul of the preserve's management philosophy, led by Reese, whose once radical theories were now hailed as visionary. They established new observation protocols designed to identify and understand the social bonds between animals. They created support systems for animals that were isolated or rejected by their herds, recognizing that loneliness could be as dangerous as any predator. And then there was the matter of the python. The rangers tracked the injured snake to a rocky outcrop. Its massive body was bruised and cut, but the wounds were not life-threatening. The standard procedure for a dangerous, invasive species would be to euthanize it. But the memory of Goliath's mercy stayed Sam's hand. That bull had a chance to kill it, and he didn't. Sam said to Reese, who are we to be less merciful than a bison? After several calls, they found a specialized reptile sanctuary in Florida that was willing to take the python. Arranging the transport was a complex and expensive endeavor, but the staff felt a moral obligation to see it through. The act of saving the python became a symbol of their new commitment A promise to honor the lesson Goliath had taught them, that every life has value and that strength is best measured by the compassion one shows to the defeated. In the weeks that followed, Goliath and his adopted calf, who the staff had named Titan, became the heart of the preserve. Visitors would come from all over to catch a glimpse of the unlikely pair. The massive bull's devotion to the small calf was a constant source of wonder. He would guide Titan to the best grazing spots, shield him from the hot sun with his own massive shadow, and stand guard while the calf slept. His fierce, protective nature was now understood not as aggression, but as a profound and beautiful expression of love. Reese became the lead biologist of the newly formed Behavioral Research Unit, her work now celebrated as groundbreaking. She spent her days in the field documenting the intricate relationship between Goliath and Titan. Their story became the centerpiece of the preserve's educational programs, teaching thousands of visitors about the deep emotional capacity of animals. Goliath's tale was a powerful reminder that the beings we are quickest to label as dangerous or monstrous are often the ones with the most profound stories of lost survival and an incredible capacity to love. Reese often sat on the same ridge where her journey with Goliath began, watching as Titan, now a sturdy young bull, grazed peacefully beside his formidable father. She realized that Goliath hadn't just saved a calf that day, he had saved them all. He had saved them from their own ignorance, from their limited understanding of the world. He had forced them to see the universe not as a collection of separate beings, but as an interconnected family, where the strongest are not those who dominate, but those who protect the vulnerable. Is it possible that the creatures we deem most wild and untamable are simply guardians in disguise, living out ancient codes of honor and protection? Are they waiting for us to look past our own fears and see the profound love they are so fiercely defending? The seasons that followed the Great Fire were ones of quiet grace and deepening purpose. The Blackfoot River Wildlife Preserve, reborn and fortified, became a living library of stories of resilience. Titan, the once fragile calf, grew into a magnificent young bull, his frame rivaling the epic proportions of his adoptive father Goliath. But where Goliath's power was a testament to survival, Titan's was one of thriving. His coat held a deeper luster, his movements a youthful energy that his aging father now watched with a serene and knowing pride. Reese Thorne was no longer the quiet newcomer. She was a leading voice in conservation biology. Her work at the preserve had redefined the field, replacing cold calculus with compassionate observation. She had completed her doctorate, her thesis a groundbreaking study on the interspecies. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Transmission of empathy, focusing on Goliath and Titan. Their story was now required reading in ecology programs, a powerful counter-narrative to the old dog-eat-dog view of the natural world. The world was in balance, a hard-won peace that felt as vast and settled as the Oklahoma sky. But the wild is a river, not a pond, and time is its most relentless current. It began subtly, a slight hesitation in Goliath's step, a tremor in his powerful hind legs after a long walk, a new weariness in his eyes that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with the honorable weight of years. Reese noted it in her private journals with a clinical precision that could not mask the ache in her heart. Goliath, the immortal, the living legend, was growing old. The first time it became undeniable was during a crisp autumn afternoon. Titan, now in the full flush of his youthful power, was sparring with an ancient oak tree at the edge of their territory, his horns thudding against the thick bark in a rhythmic display of strength and vitality. Goliath watched from a distance, a fond indulgence in his gaze. Titan then turned to his father and, with a playful snort, lowered his head in a gesture of challenge. It was a ritual they had performed hundreds of times, a loving contest between father and son in the past. Goliath would meet the challenge with an immovable force, a gentle reminder of the unyielding hierarchy. But this time, when their massive heads met, Goliath's legs buckled for a split second. He was driven back a single involuntary step before he regained his footing. Titan pulled back instantly, the playfulness vanishing from his eyes. Replaced by a look of profound confusion and concern, Goliath simply shook his great head and nudged his son affectionately as if to say, "It is the way of things." But the shift had occurred, the balance of power had irrevocably tilted, and both of them knew it. That night a storm of instinct began to rage within Titan. His body coursed with the power of his prime. The biological imperative to lead, to protect, to establish his dominance was a deafening roar in his blood. Yet his heart was bound by a loyalty and love for his father that was deeper than any instinct. He became restless, his magnificent energy turning inward, creating a tension that shimmered around him like heat off summer asphalt. He would pace the fence lines, his gaze fixed on the main herd, grazing miles away, a family he had never known, a world to which he did not belong. Was he destined to be a king like his father, or was he to remain a prince forever in the shadow of a fading throne? It was into this delicate and shifting world that a new kind of predator arrived. He did not come with teeth or claws, but with contracts and lawyers. His name was Silas Kane, a billionaire industrialist with a chilling hobby. He collected not art or cars, but living legends. His private estate in the Ozarks was a macabre gallery of the world's most iconic animals, purchased or acquired through legal strong-arming and kept in gilded cages as testament to his own power. He owned the last descendant of a famous racehorse, a grizzly bear that had once been a movie star, and a white lion of legendary lineage now. He had set his sights on Goliath. Kane arrived at the preserve in a black helicopter that settled on the lawn like an enormous insect. His suit was immaculate, his smile polished, and his eyes held the cold, predatory emptiness of a shark. He came not with a request, but with a demand backed by a team of lawyers. He had discovered an obscure clause in the state's wildlife management code, a loophole concerning the transfer of animals previously designated as problematic. His argument was as cynical as it was brilliant. Goliath, now of advanced age and with a documented history of aggression, could be deemed of financial and safety liability to a state-funded preserve. Under this clause, a private conservationist had the right to petition for the acquisition of such an animal to provide specialized end-of-life care in a private facility. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Silas Kane said to a Reese and a stunned Sam Cody, his voice a smooth veneer over a core of steel. "I am here to offer this magnificent creature a dignified retirement. My facility is world-class. He will want for nothing." Reese felt a cold fury rise within her. She knew of Kane's facility. It was a sterile prison where animals were kept isolated and over-medicated, their spirits broken for the viewing pleasure of his wealthy friends. He didn't want to give Goliath a dignified retirement. He wanted to own a legend. He wanted to put the hero of the Blackfoot River Preserve in a cage and call it a trophy. When a hero's strength begins to fade and the world he built is threatened not by predators, but by human greed, can the legacy of love he created be strong enough to protect him? And what happens when a son must choose between his own nature and protecting his father's final peace? The legal battle that ensued was a war fought on two fronts: in the sterile meeting rooms of the State Wildlife Commission and on the sprawling plains of the preserve. Silas Kane's legal team was formidable, a pack of sleek, well-paid wolves who buried Reese and her small staff under an avalanche of motions, injunctions, and public records requests. Kane's PR firm began a subtle but vicious media campaign, planting stories in conservative blogs and news outlets that questioned the safety of keeping an aging, unpredictable animal like Goliath at a publicly accessible facility. They painted the preserve's philosophy as sentimental and reckless, and Reese as a naive idealist endangering the public for the sake of one animal. Back at the preserve, the tension was palpable. Titan could sense the stress in the humans, and in his father his restlessness grew into a constant, agitated guard. He patrolled the perimeter of their territory, his muscles coiled tight, his eyes scanning for the strange vehicles that now appeared on the ridgelines, carrying Kane's surveyors and legal observers. His protective instincts, once a source of comfort, were now a liability every time He postured aggressively at the fence line, a long lens. Camera would capture the image, providing more fuel for Cain's argument that the Goliath line was inherently unstable. We have to keep him calm. Reese told Sam her own nerves frayed and raw. Cain is using Titan's love for his father against us. Public fight was equally brutal. Reese gave interviews to every friendly media outlet she could find, sharing the story of Goliath's heroism, of his fatherhood, of the profound lessons he had taught the world. The story went viral again, but this time it was not a simple tale of hope. It was a call to arms, a battle between compassionate conservation and cynical greed. Hashtags like #ProtectGoliath and #StandWithReese trended for weeks, and a crowdfunding campaign to cover their legal fees raised hundreds of thousands of dollars overnight. But Cain had deeper pockets and political connections that ran to the governor's office. It felt like they were fighting a hydra. For every legal motion they defeated, two more would spring up. The pressure was immense, and Reese found herself sleeping only a few hours a night, poring over legal documents and scientific data, trying to build an unassailable case for why Goliath belonged at the preserve. One afternoon, as one of Cain's legal observers stood near the fence taking notes, Titan's frustration boiled over. With a roar that shook the ground, the young bull charged the fence, his massive horns ramming the steel posts with enough force to make them bend. It was a terrifying display of raw power, exactly what Cain's team had been hoping to capture on film. But then something extraordinary happened. Goliath, who had been resting under a distant oak tree, rose to his feet. He walked slowly, deliberately toward his agitated son. He didn't confront him. He didn't challenge his display of aggression. He simply walked up and stood beside him, placing his own massive body between Titan and the fence. He nudged Titan gently with his head, a silent command, a father's plea for peace. "This is not our way." The gesture seemed to say, "This is not how we win this battle." Titan struggled for a moment, his rage warring with his lifelong devotion to the bull beside him. He let out one more frustrated snort, then the tension drained from his body. He yielded to his father's wisdom and allowed the old king to lead him away from the fence toward the quiet center of their territory. The entire exchange was captured by a documentary filmmaker who had been living at the preserve for a month, filming a follow-up to Goliath's original story. The footage was breathtaking, not for its violence, but for its profound demonstration of wisdom and restraint. It showed that Goliath's influence was not just a memory. It was an active living force that shaped the world around him. Reese knew instantly that she had found the heart of her legal argument. The hearing was scheduled for the following week in the state capitol. The odds were stacked against them. Cain's influence was pervasive, and the obscure legal clause he was using was a powerful weapon. But Reese had something Cain could never buy. She had the truth. The final days before the hearing were a blur of preparation. Reese worked with her pro bono legal team to craft a presentation that blended science with story, data with soul. On the morning of the hearing, as she was about to leave, she went to say goodbye to Goliath. She found him and Titan standing together on the ridge where she had first watched them so many years ago. Goliath looked at her, and for a moment she saw the same fierce protective fire in his eyes that she had seen during the Python attack. But it was not directed at her. It was directed at the world beyond the preserve's borders, a king defending his kingdom to the very end. Titan stood beside him, no longer a restless prince, but a steadfast guardian ready to assume the mantle he now understood was defined not by power, but by love. In a world that so often confuses aggression with strength, can the quiet dignity of a hero's life win a war against greed? And what is a son's greatest tribute to his father? To inherit his power, or to learn the grace of his wisdom? The hearing room was a cold, sterile space, a stark contrast to the wild open beauty of the preserve. Silas Cain sat at one table, flanked by his expensive lawyers, radiating an aura of confident power. Reese, Sam, and their small legal team sat at the other, feeling like a provincial delegation facing an imperial court. The room was packed with reporters, state officials, and concerned citizens. The air was thick with anticipation. Cain's lawyers Presented first, their arguments were slick, logical, and devoid of emotion. They presented charts, showing the statistical risk of keeping an aging bull. They quoted obscure regulations and cited precedent from other states. They painted a picture of the preserve as a well-meaning, but ultimately irresponsible organization, and a Riss as a sentimental scientist, whose judgment was clouded by her attachment to one animal. Then, it was Arisa's turn. She walked to the podium, not with a stack of legal documents, but with a single tablet in her hand. Her voice was quiet, but steady as she began her presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her eyes sweeping across the room. You have heard a great deal today about liability, about regulations, and about risk. I am not here to talk about those things. I am here to talk about value, but not the kind of value you can measure in dollars. She put up a picture on the large screen behind her. It was a photo of Goliath standing guard over the terrified calf after the python attack. "This is Goliath," she said, acting not as a problem animal, but as a protector, a surrogate father who risked his own life to save an orphan. This act alone redefined our understanding of empathy in his species. She then showed a series of photos and data, charts not of aggression but of healing. She showed Goliath calming other traumatized animals. She showed the statistical success of the sanctuary's program, since his heroism had inspired their new philosophy. She showed letters from children who had been touched by his story, but her final piece of evidence was the video. It was the raw, unedited footage of Goliath calming Titan at the fence line. The room fell silent as they watched the old bull's quiet intervention, his gentle wisdom, his ability to diffuse a tense situation, not with force, but with grace. When the video ended, Ariss looked directly at the commission members. Silas Kane wants to put this hero in a cage and call it a trophy. He argues that Goliath's life should be defined by his age and his history of aggression, but Goliath's life is defined by his love, by his courage, and by the wisdom he continues to share with the world. To remove him from the home he has so fiercely protected would not be an act of conservation. It would be an act of desecration. She paused, letting her words sink in. The question before you is not a legal one, it is a moral one. What is the true measure of a life? Is it the data on a chart, or is it the love that life inspires in others? She returned to her seat. The silence in the room was absolute. The commission deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, their chairman's face was unreadable, but his verdict was clear. The petition to transfer the bison, known as Goliath, is denied. He belongs at the Blackfoot River Preserve, where his legacy can continue to inspire and educate. The room erupted in applause. Ariss and Sam embraced, tears streaming down their faces. Silas Kane stormed out of the room, his mask of civility finally gone, revealing the ugly face of thwarted greed. The news spread instantly. Public support had won the day. The quiet truth of Goliath's life had proven more powerful than a billionaire's influence. Back at the preserve, it was as if the animals themselves knew the tension that had gripped the sanctuary for weeks finally dissipated. Titan's restless pacing ceased, replaced by a calm vigilance. He had found his purpose, not in challenging his father, but in defending his father's peace. Goliath's health continued to decline in the months that followed. His movements grew slower, and he spent most of his days resting in his favorite sun-drenched meadow. But he was not in pain. He was surrounded by the family he had built in the kingdom. He had saved. Ariss spent every evening with him, sometimes just sitting in silence, sometimes reading to him from her research papers. Papers he had inspired. Titan was always nearby, a silent guardian watching over his father with a devotion that was absolute. The end came on a perfect evening in late spring. The sky was painted in the soft colors of a prairie sunset. Goliath lay in the meadow, his breathing slow and shallow. Ariss sat beside him, her hand resting on his great shaggy head. Titan stood vigil a few feet away, his powerful frame a silhouette against the setting sun. Goliath let out one last soft rumble, a sound of profound contentment, and then he was still. Ariss wept not with the sorrow of loss, but with the deep gratitude of having known such a spirit. Titan let out a low, mournful call that echoed across the plains, a son's farewell to the king who had taught him everything. But Goliath's story did not end with his death. His spirit was now part of the preserve's very soil. His legacy lived on in the dozens of animals he had helped to heal and in the philosophy of compassion that now guided its every action. A few months later, a new orphaned calf was brought to the sanctuary. It was small, weak, and terrified of the world. Reese watched as Titan, a magnificent bull in his own right, now the undisputed leader of the preserve, approached the newcomer. He did not haze or threaten him. He lowered his massive head and gently nudged the calf, making the same soft rumbling sounds of comfort his father had once made for him. The cycle was continuing. The legacy was alive. How do we measure the life of a hero? Is it by the battles he won, or by the love he leaves behind? For a true king's reign never truly ends, it lives on in the hearts of those he taught to be brave, to be gentle, and to protect the vulnerable until the very end. The 2 years following Goliath's passing were a testament to his enduring legacy. The Blackfoot River Wildlife Preserve flourished under a philosophy of compassionate strength that was now simply known as the way Titan had ascended to his father's throne, not through brute force, but by the unanimous consent of the herd. He led with a quiet wisdom that belied his youth. His immense power was tempered by the gentleness he had learned at his father's side. He was a king in full command of his kingdom, and peace reigned over the tall grass prairie. Reese Thorne, now Dr. Thorne in her own right, had become a luminary in her field. Her research on the Goliath effect had sent ripples through the scientific community, proving that empathy, compassion, and social intelligence were not abstract concepts, but measurable forces that could reshape animal behavior and herd dynamics. Echo, the orphaned calf that Titan had adopted in the shadow of his father's death, was now a boisterous yearling, a symbol of the continuing cycle of protection and care. He shadowed Titan everywhere, a living embodiment of the sanctuary's promise that no soul would ever be left behind. But the natural world is a constant dance between creation and decay, and even the most perfect peace is subject to the indifferent whims of biology. The harbinger arrived on a sweltering July afternoon, a lone bison cow wandering in from the unfenced wilderness beyond the preserve's western boundary. She moved with a strange, jerky gait, her head held at an unnatural angle, her eyes vacant and unseeing. The other animals gave her a wide berth, their instincts screaming at them that something was profoundly wrong. Titan, sensing the wrongness, immediately herded his own family, including Echo, to the far side of their territory. Placing himself between them and the afflicted newcomer, the strange cow staggered for another 100 yards before her legs gave out and she collapsed in a heap in the tall grass. By the time Reese and her team arrived, the cow was dead, a silent, unsettling monument in the heart of their sanctuary. The necropsy was performed under strict quarantine protocols in the preserve's state-of-the-art lab. Reese worked with a methodical focus, her hands moving with the practiced skill of a surgeon, but her heart was heavy with a nameless dread. The cow's brain tissue under the microscope revealed something terrifying, something she had only ever read about in grim epidemiological textbooks: the telltale spongiform lesions, the unmistakable signature of a prion disease, a relentlessly fatal neurodegenerative illness, similar to chronic wasting disease. But this was a variant no one had ever seen before. It was faster, more aggressive, and its method of transmission was unknown. She named it Phantom Prairie sickness for the way it seemed to steal the spirit of an animal long before it took its life. The preserve was immediately placed under a full lockdown. No animals and no animals. Out the sanctuary that had been a beacon of hope for the world had become a potential powder keg, its invisible fences now the walls of a potential tomb. The news brought the full weight of the federal government down upon them. Director Miles Evans of the Department of Agriculture arrived a few days later, a man whose crisp suit and polished shoes seemed an affront to the dusty reality of the preserve. He was a man of protocols and statistics, a bureaucrat who saw the world in terms of acceptable losses and containment strategies. He reviewed Reese's lab results, listened to her report with a detached professional air, and then delivered his verdict with the cold finality of a judge passing sentence. Dr. Thorne, your findings are alarming. This new variant is highly transmissible and 100% fatal, the only responsible course of action, according to established federal protocol, is complete depopulation of the herd. To prevent a regional epidemic, my teams will be here in 1 week to begin the cull. Iris felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Cull depopulation. These were sterile euphemisms for the systematic slaughter of every bison in the sanctuary. The herd that Goliath had died to protect, the family that Titan now led with such grace, the living legacy of their life's work. Director Evans, you can't be serious. Iris protested, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and fury. There are over 300 animals in that herd. Many of them are the direct descendants of Goliath. This isn't just a herd, it's a family, a culture. Dr. Thorne Evans replied, his voice devoid of emotion. I am not here to debate the emotional attachments you have to your livestock. I am here to contain a public health emergency. You have 7 days to prepare your staff. After that, my department will take over. The silence that followed was heavier than any grief the sanctuary had ever known. The invisible enemy was at their gates, and the supposed cure was more monstrous than the disease itself. When a sanctuary built to save lives is condemned to become a place of death, and the enemy is an invisible plague that cannot be fought, where does hope lie? Can the wisdom of a new king protect his herd from a threat he cannot see? The 7-day deadline hung over the preserve like a guillotine. The staff moved like ghosts, their faces drawn and somber. The place that had once buzzed with the energy of hope was now shrouded in a pall of impending doom. But Iris Thorne refused to surrender. She spent 48 hours straight in her lab, surrounded by genetic sequencers and epidemiological models fueled by caffeine and a desperate burning rage. She would not let Goliath's legacy be erased by a government protocol. She formulated a plan, a wild, improbable gambit that was their only sliver of hope. She requested an emergency meeting with Director Evans, who agreed to see her with an air of weary indulgence. Director Evans, Iris began, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Your protocol is based on an assumption that we cannot identify infected animals before they become symptomatic. But what if we could? What if we could test the entire herd, isolate the sick and save the healthy? Evans looked at her as if she were insane. Dr. Thorne, there's no live animal test for prion diseases. Diagnosis can only be confirmed post-mortem. That is a scientific fact. Not anymore, Iris replied, sliding a data file across the table. For the past year, I have been developing an experimental diagnostic test based on protein misfolding cyclic amplification. It can detect the prion protein in blood and saliva samples with 98% accuracy. It's never been deployed on this scale, but it works. Evans studied the data, his skeptical expression slowly giving way to a flicker of professional curiosity. The science was sound, but the logistics were a nightmare. Testing 300 wild bison in a matter of days was an undertaking of staggering complexity and danger. Fine, Evans said, finally seeing a potential political win in backing a new scientific breakthrough. I'll give you a chance, Dr. Thorne. You have until my deadline expires 96 hours from now to implement your plan and prove it can work. You must test every animal and humanely euthanize any that are positive to show you can make the hard choices. If you can contain the initial outbreak and present a viable long-term strategy, I will consider rescinding the call order. But if you fail, my teams will proceed as planned. It was an impossible timeline, Herculean task, but it was a chance. The race against the plague began at dawn. The preserve transformed into a massive field hospital. Biohazard tents were erected, and the staff donned sterile suits that made them look like astronauts on a hostile planet. The first challenge was getting samples from the herd. This was where Titan's leadership was put to the ultimate test. The disease had begun to spread, whispers of it moving through the herd like a malevolent spirit. A few animals were starting to show the early signs: the subtle tremor, the vacant stare, the sudden unprovoked aggression. The social fabric of the herd was beginning to fray. Panic was a constant undercurrent, but Titan held them together. He moved through the herd like a great stabilizing force, his calm presence a bulwark against the rising tide of fear. He seemed to know which animals were sick before anyone else. He would gently but firmly steer them away from the healthy members of the herd, especially from Echo, who he kept tucked by his side at all times. When Aris and her team moved in with their dart guns to collect blood samples, it was Titan who became their partner. He seemed to understand what they were doing. He would use his massive body to separate a single animal from the group, holding it in place, just long enough for Aris to get a clean shot. His trust in her was absolute, and that trust flowed from him to the rest of the herd. They endured this strange, unsettling process because their king showed no fear. He was a bridge between human science and animal instinct, a leader guiding his family through a terrifying new reality. The lab ran 24 hours a day, the machines humming a constant prayer for negative results. The first batch of results came back on the second day. They were devastating. Nearly 15% of the herd was positive, some of them showing no outward symptoms. Yet this was the most heartbreaking part of Aris's promise to Director Evans for her plan to work. She had to be as ruthless as the plague itself. Each positive result meant a life had to be ended. To save the rest, she performed the euthanasias herself, her hands steady, but her heart breaking with every single one. Each animal was a life. She had known a part of the family she was now forced to sacrifice. She was a healer compelled to become an executioner, and the weight of that choice was a scar she knew she would carry forever. By the morning of the final day, they had tested every animal. The final tally was agonizing. 47 bison had to be euthanized, but over 250 healthy animals had been saved and successfully segregated into a clean zone on the preserve's southern pasture. As Director Evans's helicopter landed, Aris stood waiting for him, her face smudged with dirt, her body aching with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with the fire of a battle hard fought. She handed him the final report, the data, the containment strategy, and the evidence of their impossible success in the face of an unstoppable plague. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act with compassion amidst heartbreak. When science and instinct must work together against impossible odds, can a partnership between a woman and a bison rewrite the rules of survival? Director Evans was a man who lived by the book, by data, and by protocol. But as he reviewed the files Aris presented and watched the video footage of Titan calmly assisting the biosuited humans in managing his herd, something in his rigid worldview began to shift. He saw not just numbers, but a community fighting for its existence. He saw not a liability, but a leader in the form of a great bull. He saw not a sentimental scientist, but a commander who had made brutal choices to save her people. The data is compelling, Dr. Thorne, he admitted. His tone softened for the first time. Your experimental test and containment strategy are more effective than I thought possible. He walked with Aris to the ridge overlooking the two segregated herds. On one side, the smaller group of survivors stood clustered around Titan, their numbers diminished but their spirit unbroken. On the other side lay the vast empty pastures of the quarantine zone, a silent memorial to the ones they had lost. The cull order is rescinded, Evans said quietly. I will endorse your Titan protocol as a new federal guideline for managing wildlife disease outbreaks. What you have accomplished here is more than just saving a herd. You have given us a new model, a better way to move forward. The aftermath of the plague left deep scars on the preserve. The loss of nearly 50 animals was a wound that would never fully heal, but from that wound grew a new kind of strength. The surviving herd was bonded by their shared ordeal, their social structure more resilient than ever. Titan had been tested by an invisible fire and had emerged a leader of profound wisdom. He had proven that leadership was not just about physical strength, but about emotional fortitude, the ability to hold a community together in the face of unimaginable fear. The Titan protocol became Aris's life work. She and her team refined the process, creating a blueprint for humane and effective disease management that was adopted by wildlife agencies around the world. The Blackfoot River Preserve became a teaching facility, a place where rangers and scientists came to learn how to battle plagues with compassion. Instead of just call orders, the sanctuary that Goliath had founded with an act of love had now pioneered a new way to save entire ecosystems from an invisible death. Years past, the herd slowly rebuilt its numbers. The grasslands healed, and the memory of the plague softened into a somber legend, a story of loss and survival told to new generations of rangers and researchers. One evening, Arise, now a graying and deeply respected elder in her field, stood on Goliath's ridge. She watched Titan, now a venerable patriarch himself, his great shaggy head silvered with age, standing at the center of a thriving, healthy herd. Beside him stood Eco, now a powerful bull in his own right, and beside Eco was a new calf, a new generation born into a world made safer by the sacrifices of those who came before them. 3 generations of a single line of compassionate kings stood before her, a testament to a legacy that had endured fire, human greed, and a deadly plague. Arise smiled, a deep and peaceful feeling settling in her. So Goliath was gone, but he was everywhere. She saw him in Titan's wise and patient gaze. She saw him in Echo's protective stance over the young calf. And she saw him in the very philosophy of life that now animated this sacred ground. What is the true nature of immortality? Is it to live forever, or is it to create a legacy of love and resilience so powerful that it can weather any storm, overcome any plague, and be reborn stronger in the hearts of the generations that follow? The lineage of compassionate kings now defined the soul of the Blackfoot River wildlife. Preserve. The story of Goliath and Titan was no longer just a local legend. It was a foundational myth taught to every new ranger, biologist, and visitor, a testament to the idea that true strength was rooted in protection, not dominance. Years melted into one another, seasons turning with the gentle rhythm of the prairie. Arise Thorn, her hair now the color of winter frost, her face a beautiful map of laugh lines and thoughtful furrows, had become as much a part of this land as the ancient oaks. She had long since retired from the day-to-day operations of the preserve, her life's work having culminated in a global network of sanctuaries, all operating under the principles of the Titan Protocol. She now served as a sage in residence, a guiding spirit whose wisdom was sought by scientists and world leaders alike. On a warm autumn afternoon, the entire preserve gathered on the ridge that had come to be known as Goliath's Watch. It was the 20th anniversary of the Great Plague, a day not of mourning but of solemn celebration, a day to honor the resilience of the herd and the legacy that had risen from so much loss. A bronze statue had been commissioned, not of a charging bull but of a massive bison standing protectively over a small calf, its inscription simple but profound: "The measure of a king is the peace of his kingdom." Titan, now an ancient and venerable patriarch, stood near the ceremony, his great shaggy head held high, his presence still commanding, but his eyes holding the serene, distant gaze of one who has seen all of life's seasons. His great-grandson, a sturdy young calf, full of youthful vigor, stood beside him, a perfect echo of Titan's own beginning. With Goliath, the guest of honor was a young woman named Dr. Alara Vance, the preserve's new lead biologist. She was brilliant, passionate, and possessed an intuitive gift for understanding animals that reminded everyone of a young Arise Thorn. Alara stood at the podium, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the crowd. "We are here today because 2 decades ago, Dr. Thorn and a great bull named Titan refused to accept that a protocol of death was the only answer. They chose a harder path, a path of hope, science, and an unshakable belief in the value of every life. The Titan Protocol, which saved this herd and has since saved countless others around the world, was not just a scientific breakthrough. It was a moral one. It taught us that our first response to crisis should not be to destroy, but to understand, not to cull, but to care. As Alara spoke, Arise watched from her seat beside an aging Sam Cody, her heart filled with a quiet joy that was as vast as the prairie itself. She looked at the statue, at Titan, at the young calf, at the bright-eyed Dr. Vance, and she saw not an ending, but an endless, beautiful beginning, a perfect circle of life and legacy. Later that afternoon, as the crowds dispersed, Arise Walked alone to the statue she ran, her hand over the cool bronze, feeling the familiar shape of Goliath's powerful shoulder. She closed her eyes, and the years fell away. She was a young woman again, standing in this very spot watching a lonely bull, and sensing a kindred spirit. She remembered the terror of the python attack and the breathtaking moment of Goliath's strategic genius. She remembered the cold fury that filled her when Silas Cain tried to turn her friend into a trophy, and the quiet, triumphant wisdom of the old bull teaching his son to meet aggression with peace. She remembered the desperate race against the plague, the agonizing choices, and the quiet partnership with Titan that had turned the tide. She had lived a lifetime on this land, a life intertwined with the epic saga of these magnificent beasts. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft touch on her arm. She opened her eyes to see Dr. Vance standing beside her. "I hope this isn't too forward, Dr. Thorne," Alara said, her voice full of respect, "but I wanted to thank you not just for your work, but for your courage. You taught generations of us that the most important tool in science isn't a microscope. It's an open heart." Reese smiled, placing her hand over the young woman's. "I only listened." Alara, Goliath, and Titan were the real teachers. They just needed a human to translate for them. As they stood together, they watched Titan's great-grandson, the young calf, chasing a butterfly through the tall grass. His movements were full of the boundless joy and innocence that the sanctuary had been built to protect. Titan watched him with a fond patience, his great old body a mountain of living history. The future of the herd was secure. The legacy was safe. That evening, Aris took one last walk up to Goliath's watch. The sun was setting, casting a fiery glow across the endless sea of grass. The air was still, and the world seemed to hold its breath in the fading light. She looked out at the herd. Titan was lying down, his great journey nearing its end, but he was surrounded by his family, his great-grandson curled up beside him, resting against the warmth of his ancient flank. Aris felt a presence beside her, and she turned without surprise. In the shimmering golden light she saw him. Goliath stood there, not as a ghost, but as a memory so powerful it felt real. His form was that of his prime, magnificent, powerful, and eternal. Beside him stood Titan, not as an old bull, but as the strong young king who had faced the fire. And beside him stood Echo, and then the new calf, a line of kings stretching through time, their spirits woven into the fabric of this land. They had all taught her the same profound lesson, that our time on this earth is fleeting, but the love we give and the lives we protect create ripples that flow outward through generations, becoming a form of immortality that no plague or predator can ever destroy. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into the soft purple of twilight. Aris Thorne stood on the hill, her heart at peace. She knew that when her own time came, she would join them here, in the heart of the sanctuary, a silent guardian watching over the legacy of love that had defined her life. The true measure of a hero is not in the battles they win, but in the peace they leave behind. For a kingdom built on compassion is eternal, its borders ever expanding, its light a perpetual dawn that no darkness can ever truly extinguish, and its greatest kings never truly die. They simply become the quiet wisdom that guides the generations that follow home. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.